when some of the new prototypes are launched, we're hoping to have opportunity to supply the hydrogen to the companies doing the launches here in Michigan. He mentioned that they do have some full electric buses, and the performance in the wintertime is just not the same as with hydrogen.
How exciting it is to see these sort of test cases being proven out in the quote unquote real world to really kind of like the early adoption of technology, right? When you can have a success story from a municipality, from a school district.
It's a really great time for people to really be brave enough to launch, because, it's just going to be kind of a snowball effect of deployments, and hopefully, we'll have great success here in Michigan and other states in the U.S.
Hello and welcome to another episode of On Air Indicators. I'm Mike Chung, your host for today, and I'm delighted to introduce Christa Harrison of BNG Clean Fuel Corporation. Welcome to the program, Christa.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning.
And it was so great to meet you. We met over lunch at the Move Mobility Conference in Detroit. How did you enjoy the conference?
Oh, it was really great. They had a lot of great speakers, and it's actually the Move organization is international. So it was interesting that it was their first one in Detroit, even though, Detroit is obviously motor central, but a lot of great people. And when conferences maybe have lower attendance, this one was really great.
Terrific. And I think we both know that Move is really a mobility conference. We see all types of vehicles. Can you tell us a little bit more about Move?
So with Move, I think they were looking at new technologies. So there was a lot about, obviously electric vehicles. There's a lot of power. AI was really big, and autonomous vehicles was also a big topic there. But then also there were some discussions on hydrogen, which is, why I was really there, and I think why we're talking today.
Exactly. And for those of our listeners who may not be familiar with Move, as Christa highlighted, it was the first time we've had it in Detroit. I had the pleasure of attending for several years when it was in Austin, Texas. And when describing it to other people, it basically became clear it's almost everything but airplanes and ships, right? It's like buses, trains, transit, heavy duty trucks, autonomous trucks, all the things with vehicles that you or I might drive, and some of the financing that goes around it. So really a fascinating conference. And we got to meet because your company is kind of a pioneer in hydrogen. So tell us a little bit about BNG Clean Fuel Corporation and what your organization does, Christa.
Sure. So BNG Clean Fuel Corporation is building a vertically integrated company from production of hydrogen all the way to the distribution for vehicles or even some industrial customers. So we're really looking to try and bring a fuel that will help to cut down on greenhouse gases. It's something that's really important to all of us. And, it's not just about reducing the carbon emissions, but also just, great new technologies. So we'll talk a little bit about more of the new developments, because, a lot of people have talked about hydrogen, being around for a long time, but, it hasn't really taken on, and there's lots of great new technologies.
That sounds so fascinating. And how long has BNG been operating then?
Yeah, so BNG formed, we're just a startup with just a few of us in Colorado. There are a lot of issues with the clean air in Denver because of the valleys. You think with the mountains, you think of nice clean air, but they have some issues there. And, just transitioning the other co-founders, Elliot and Afzal, they have worked in the oil and gas industry and seen a lot of the changes, and then just looked for new opportunities with hydrogen. And myself, I've worked in powertrain strategy, and really see hydrogen as an alternative fuel compared to all the challenges that might be with some of the EV batteries. It doesn't really work for all applications necessarily. So.
Oh, thanks for sharing that. And you had told me that your role as a strategic advisor involves business development, financial management. Can you tell us a little bit more about your day-to-day?
Sure. Yeah, well, actually, with strategic advisor, it means kind of take care of everything. So, it's really interesting. And I have had some, kind of sales roles or, working externally, with customers before, but, this is, something that's a little newer for me, directly working with customers, and with government officials, also trying to plan, for, site selection. So working with government officials. So I've worked with some grants and incentives with other cities in Michigan, and now really working closely with the city of Detroit. So that's really interesting to really be in touch with what's happening locally, and that's really where a lot of the development and even funding is coming from hydrogen now, versus some of the federal programs.
I see. And you had mentioned the company is based in Colorado, but
Right.
you're based in Detroit.
Right, right.
Okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
actually, so the founders reached out to me with my automotive experience. This way I can, have a lot of connections in the automotive industry from my background. And also here in Michigan, there's also the great opportunity, because obviously there's all the technology R&D centers here in Michigan. So we can really be in touch with a lot of the vehicle launches. There are hydrogen vehicles, primarily in California and Texas. And so then when some of the new prototypes are launched, we're hoping to have opportunity to supply the hydrogen to the companies doing the launches here in Michigan.
That's terrific. Thanks for sharing that background. And you mentioned something about powertrain strategy. Can you tell us a little
Right.
bit about some of the different aspects of automotive that you've worked in, and then how you came to jump on board B&G?
Right, right. Well, so I've worked in a few different companies. One, starting with an industrial ceramics company that did supply parts into the automotive and a few other industries. So that was really exciting and a lot of it was commercial vehicles for really trying to get a lot of power and having to haul a lot of freight or do different things with trucks, cranes, those types of things. And my time at Ford Motor Company, I spent time in product development, so working with kind of all the different teams, the product development system, trying to manage that. And then with my time, I did actually work in China. And so I was working for one of the smaller vehicles that was sold in the Europe and Asian markets.
Mm-hmm.
And you with the whole entire powertrain system, you have an engine and you want it to be fuel efficient. You have the transmission of how it's going to drive, and then you also have the exhaust system to see how you're going to deal with emissions. And as you have to try and increase the performance of all of those, there's a lot more cost. And so then it's always the balance between performance of the vehicle and then certainly with all of the other features as well. And so I just saw how the costs were increasing over time, especially for the emissions control and the exhaust systems. And so, and it translated exactly to some of those same minerals or the same cost increases in, the EV batteries. So, just trying to think of another fuel. And I think too, working around all the engineers, I mean, really some of the best engine engineers globally, we had people in Germany, India, Europe, obviously North America as well, really just seeing how to tweak an engine, was really exciting. So
That's fascinating. And you touched on something interesting in terms of, I feel like as a car culture, the United States and other advanced countries, our expectations are pretty high. We're sort of used to a certain level of performance, features, functionality. So if a new technology, a new powertrain or new power source comes along, the consumers, they want it to be like from the get-go, very, very good, right?
right, right. And I think seamless and not kind of any change to what they're really used to.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. So like thinking about vehicles and hydrogen, can you talk a little bit about how many hydrogen vehicles there are, whether in the United States
Mhm.
or globally, and the types of vehicles those might kind
Sure,
of go across?
sure. Yeah, actually, if we talk more about the U.S., because globally, there's kind of different pockets of some of the different deployments, and what's really interesting is that the largest volume of hydrogen type vehicles in the U.S. are actually forklifts. So
Forklift.
Forklifts, right. So I think people know that there's obviously, there were the diesel, propane,
Hmm.
battery, and then there are now the hydrogen forklifts. So there's probably about 50,000 of those in the US. So that's
50,000
really, again,
forklifts. That's
touching on
fascinating.
how, yeah, hydrogen is in use all around us, but,
Uh-huh.
just different than, vehicles people are driving themselves.
And I think you had shared in terms of passenger cars, there's nearly 20,000 of them.
Right. Yes. So, and a lot of those are in California, but even the Honda CRV is produced not very far from me, south of here in Ohio.
Okay,
Yeah.
terrific. And then I think you had also mentioned electric buses as well as
Mhm.
heavy duty trucks. Can you tell us a little
Right.
bit about those?
Yeah. So, for heavy duty trucks, one of the suppliers, Nikola's, so they had maybe over 200 trucks that were delivered as of the middle of, or maybe the beginning of this year. There are maybe around 60 to 70 fuel cell buses. So there is, and this is where we can kind of touch on that there's the two methods of using hydrogen fuel, either a fuel cell, which is like a battery pack, but uses the hydrogen as the fuel. So the pack is a little bit more, a little less intense with the minerals that are needed compared to a full electric battery. And then also in an internal combustion engine as well. So most of the deployments for the heavy duty trucks are with a fuel cell.
Oh, thanks for touching on that. And thinking about, I just want to touch on those forklifts a little bit. Like the performance, I mean, 50,000 forklifts, and you said there are other power sources available. Is there a performance advantage that you're seeing with the hydrogen power, like for the forklifts? Like, is there a compelling value proposition that way?
Actually, forklifts isn't really, one of my expertise per se, although I do know a little bit more about making them autonomous from some of the other work that I did at a company for systems automation. So I've worked on the product development side and then also the kind of equipment side, and even a supplier too of parts in automotive. So,
Right, right. Well, sorry to put you on the spot
oh
like
no,
that, but I
that's all
think
right. Yeah.
but I think it's interesting from a sort of a use case perspective, right? Because if there are electric buses, there are heavy duty trucks. I think about the different use cases in a country as far spanning as America with so many different weather considerations. You mentioned the valleys or beneath the mountains where perhaps the air can get trapped from an air quality perspective. And then from a passenger vehicle, a commuter, a industrial site. And I think that it certainly seems clear to me, at least, that forklifts, and I'm sure there are going to be other applications where you have a specialized, kind of a niche that can be really filled well by alternative power. And that kind of brings me to my next question, going back to BNG, is solutions for fleets, for
Right.
instance. So when I think of fleets, a lot of things come to mind. It could be a rental car agency. It could be a municipality, a school district. Am I on the right path here, Krista?
Well, for rental cars, maybe not initially, just like there, were some of the deployments of, electric vehicles and, it works where there's, the infrastructure and charging stations. But just like you said, for municipalities, so certainly hydrogen buses. So there's a fleet of hydrogen buses, even in Flint, Michigan, and then also a fairly large fleet with the SARTA organization in Ohio as well. So, and actually at the MOVE conference, there was a representative from the Flint transit agency, and he mentioned that they do have some full electric buses, and the performance in the wintertime is just not the same as with hydrogen. They can certainly rely on the hydrogen with the performance. And he said they're even having to stretch their total driving because they're actually driving for some of the schools. So across the US there's actually an issue with needing school bus drivers and then maybe even the equipment, right? So as we're looking at, how to try and, utilize resources as communities are challenged, then maybe that's a way to kind of combine, transport within the communities.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, so Flint has a program with electric buses, but in the cold winter,
Mm.
the battery life, the battery range is not quite as strong, which is pretty well known.
Right.
But hydrogen in cold weather, it sounds like it's really not an issue. Am I hearing that correctly?
Right. Yeah, not at all, not at all, and certainly too. There was even discussion about the challenge of providing the heat or air conditioning on the electric buses, that it really affects the overall performance. And there's actually some supplemental diesel power for some of the electric buses. It might be some of the older models, but in order just to power the air conditioning and the heat. But with hydrogen, it's still the similar system as any of the diesel buses.
That's fascinating, yeah, because like you said, the HVAC, that's an energy intensive operation, and the hydrogen and at least the newer EV technologies are able to accommodate those needs, right? Yeah, so thinking about, so shifting from kind of vehicles and fleets, and or maybe one last thing about the fleets is how exciting it is to see these sort of test cases being proven out in the quote unquote real world to really kind of like the early adoption of technology, right? When you can have a success story from a municipality, from a school district, and you did point out a good point regarding infrastructure. So something like a Hertz or an enterprise, that's a little bit different than a singular school district, a singular municipality. But it sounds like we're seeing success. So that sounds promising for the future of
Right.
hydrogen.
Mm-hmm. Right,
Yeah.
right. And thinking about fleets, as we maybe talk about that, that there's certainly opportunity, and there are, some deployments of, you would think that if there's a full fleet of trucks, probably maybe 10 or more, and they could just have the fueling, right there on site. And so then, they can, just continually use the fuel and not having to have it shipped, which is actually really the best model for deploying hydrogen, to not transport it a long distance in trucks.
Okay. Well, that's a great segue to fuel, because I think we've talked a little bit about availability of fuel, where it's sourced, how it's produced. Can you talk to us a little bit about the availability of hydrogen fuel? Where are you getting it? How you're manufacturing it? How your
Right.
company plays in that space as an advisor, if you will?
Sure. Actually, hydrogen is used quite a lot in the U.S. in processing. And, I got a few numbers so then people could kind of have an understanding, although this will also talk about how, hydrogen and energy is really managed in the U.S.
Sure.
So the market size in 2024 was around 22 billion. And there were 10 million metric tons that was used. And it's primarily used in refining petroleum, so oil refining and making different kind of lubricants and things with that. And also ammonia production and steel production.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you drive by any large factory, then they're probably using hydrogen actually as a raw material.
Okay.
Rather than a fuel. There are other, applications to power it. But then looking at other gases. So natural gas, though, was 100 billion. So versus 22 million. But it's actually interesting when you look at natural gas figures, because we apparently export a lot of natural gas. So when there's actually the production and trying to, just isolate the use in the U.S. and I think, thinking about data, too, I think is really how we started talking and meeting. So when you think about with AI kind of consolidating a lot of data, I think it's really careful. You need to be careful about what the different units are, because looking at these different fuels. So, you have hydrogen that's quoted in metric tons. Natural gas is quoted in cubic feet per day. And then even looking at propane, that's also in units per day. So, and the propane, so that, let's see. So, natural gas was maybe about 800 metric tons versus the 10 million for hydrogen. And then propane was about 2.6. But it was interesting too, when we had talked about forklifts, there's maybe about 750,000 propane forklifts in use in the US right now.
Okay. And you said there were about 50, was it 50,000 hydrogen forklifts? I'm checking my notes here.
Yes.
Well,
Yeah.
that's a
Around
pretty
50.
good dent.
Right.
50,000 versus
Right.
750,000. That's
Right.
that's pretty significant progress. Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, it's but then it's also another, opportunity to, transfer from the propane to hydrogen. But there's even school buses that are powered with propane as well.
True.
So,
True.
right. Yes. But thinking of, natural gas. So obviously we here in Michigan, we use it to heat our homes. And, that's not necessarily, down in Texas. I think we all learned that they were using electricity. I did live in Texas, kind of growing up. So, there's just different uses in the US. But even here in Michigan, there are some vans and trucks that are the part of the fleet of consumers power that are actually powered with natural gas. So there is already some experience of using, obviously different fuels, propane and natural gas, and then now hydrogen in vehicles that we're using today.
That's fascinating. Thanks for sketching out those numbers. So as you said, hydrogen is about $22 billion, 10 million metric tons, natural gas, about $100 billion market, 800 million metric tons, propane was at 2.6 million metric tons. And like you said, we have to be careful of the units. And as you highlighted, hydrogen, that's overall, that's as a source for chemical manufacturing, for ammonia production, as well as hydrogen as a fuel. Am I reiterating those correctly?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so when we think about hydrogen, comparing it to, say, diesel compared to gasoline, now it could be a little apples to oranges to bananas, depending on the units, but can you kind of put that in the context of our most dominant fuels, if you will, for vehicles?
Well, and with the applications for hydrogen, it's usually, again, the heavy duty trucks, buses and others. So the main comparator is with diesel. So looking at the performance of the engines, it's actually, really comparable. So a lot of the comparisons are also with, what is the cost of hydrogen? That's really one of the challenges, but that's one thing that we're working on. And then also it's the other systems. So like I said, with the whole entire powertrain system, once you're using hydrogen, then you're only needing just a little bit of after treatment versus the full kind of exhaust system that's needed for diesel. So you kind of have to look at the total value package. But then certainly with the performance of hydrogen, from the real, driver fleet experience, they're, really saying that it's on par. And there's actually, quite a lot of analysis that's being done in new technologies. If you don't mind, I can talk about, I attended the Hydrogen Engine Alliance conference just last week. It was held at University of Michigan, and, the analysis and, it certainly there are, some, researchers, so from the university, Argonne National Lab, but then they actually had the industry experts who are really, the technology, and people have said, oh, well, there was a hydrogen engine and what happened to that? Well, the technologies now, and the efficiency and, any of the modifications that are needed compared to a diesel engine. We're really now at the edge of being on par, with cost, performance, and, really making it a viable option for efficiency and cost.
And earlier you mentioned that being in Detroit, I would imagine that promotes opportunities to partner with the manufacturers to see where can we have hydrogen as a fuel for a new model that's coming out. So I'd hope that, because thinking about the GMs, the Fords, the Stellantis companies of the world, they have certainly, they're invested very deep in petroleum, right? But I would hope that there's opportunity for kind of making the hydrogen passenger vehicles a little bit more, growing that portion of our car park. Am I
Right.
am I thinking correct about this correctly, Christa?
Yes. So there are developments on the passenger vehicle side. So the vehicles on the road, there is the Toyota Mirai, there's the Honda CRV, and there's the Hyundai. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot the name. But actually, just because of the infrastructure for hydrogen fuel, then they're primarily sold and driven in California, and then there's maybe some deployments in Texas. But that's actually what B&G is really trying to take that opportunity to provide a fueling station, and then actually with our hydrogen technology to have the production here in Michigan, so then we could actually serve some of those vehicles. So that's on the passenger side, but there's actually more developments on the kind of mid-sized truck. I think there's some of the truck manufacturers here. I know of some prototypes, so I can't really say.
Oh yeah, totally understood.
Right?
But when you
But
say
if I
mid-size,
can, right.
yeah. I'm
Mhm.
sorry, when you say mid-sized trucks, I think about, say, Amazon and all the delivery vehicles. So
Right.
these could be like,
Mhm.
maybe it's class 5 or class 6 medium duty vehicles. So there's between Amazon, UPS, DHL, FedEx. I think there's just sounds like there's some growing opportunities in that space.
Right. And then there's also, some of the other trucks where it seems more, kind of like a, DTE, type truck where, there's some that have the
I'm sorry,
lift.
DTE?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I forget your name. So that's Detroit Edison. So the
Oh,
electric
okay.
company. Yes.
Okay,
Absolutely.
gotcha. So utilities then, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. So good old, Detroit Edison, they've still got the name here in Michigan. Yeah. So for, some of the vehicles where it seems like more just, kind of the bigger truck, kind of between a
Work
box truck
truck.
and a pickup truck. So, but still
Yeah.
the class 5 and 6. So, there's some opportunity with that. And there are, even I can talk about, the Cummins engine. So they have the X15 engine that is going to be tri-fuel. So, could use
Tri-fuel.
natural gas, diesel, or hydrogen. So, that could,
An engine that is compatible, one engine that can take any of those fuels.
right.
Fascinating.
Right. Now they may need some different, in the whole powertrain system might need some other modifications,
Of
but
course.
yeah, but they've announced that. So that could be, put into, a lot of those different applications. And then with heavy duty trucks, so there are, the fuel cell trucks, but then also, you could use a transition. And actually some of the labs at University of Michigan, they let us tour those too. And so, they're looking at, and actually, so they had some different engines that they had gotten from, different suppliers. So, and when you think of heavy duty trucks, and maybe I'll just, list a lot of them. So then, but, obviously there's, Mack Truck and PACCAR and Volvo and
Mhm.
Daimler and, many others.
Like
Um,
Freightliner and so
right,
forth. Yeah.
right. Yeah, Peterbilt, so,
Yeah.
um, there's, many of them, taking a look at, kind of all these different fuels too. So,
That's encouraging to hear. And when you mentioned utilities, DTE, that's a whole nother set of fleets right there. So,
right,
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And then when you think about, garbage trucks, fire engines, ambulance. So a lot of these, they have other systems and, things, or salt trucks, right? You need to have the hoist, and all of that takes, a lot of, and it's really bursts of power, that are really needed. And that's why you need, kind of big power to support that.
Right. And earlier you touched on the where the fuel is sourced and transport. So this is a very basic question, but for my and perhaps other listeners' benefits, in terms of production, should I be thinking about hydrogen like I'm thinking about oil, where you have to transport it from point A to point B? It needs to be kind of, whether it's mined from the earth or drilled from the earth or produced in a factory. Can you
Mhm.
tell us a little bit more about like the manufacturing?
Sure.
Is it localized to
Mhm.
certain areas? Because I think I read something
Mhm.
about the USGS, the Geological
Well, right.
Survey, discovering a new source of
Sure.
hydrogen, which kind of
Mhm.
ups that capacity, perhaps.
Right, right. Well, maybe we'll talk about that first, and then I'll talk about production since you've
I'd
mentioned
love
it.
that. Thank you.
Yeah. So, with the survey, that is just kind of general looking at, if you think about it from a topography level, and there are some, actual discoveries in Kansas where people have done the exploration, and I think some other areas nearby Kansas, and then certainly Michigan. There was the darker block, and that's actually some of the expertise from my team as well. They've traveled around the world, and you would look in the exploration to detect what was in the ground. There are a few challenges. So, first, you have to make sure if you open the big field, the hydrogen could just, kind of, come out, come out of the ground without actually capturing it. And then, there's a different atmosphere too, different conditions, to say whether or not it's stable, or, really what, if it's a kind of long-term source versus, a pocket that may just dissipate over time. So, really looking, and there really need to be experts in the field. There are a few different groups in Michigan, starting to, take a look at that. Obviously you have to work very closely with the state for any permitting. And so for, getting, just like with oil or even with natural gas, with natural hydrogen, you could, if all conditions are right and you have a good supply, you can, put it on trucks, but primarily, something, a large supply then works with distribution through pipelines. But then there's also a lot of infrastructure that's needed for that. And then, you really need to say, who's going to use it. And so that's, really, under development. And then, with transportation, we can talk about. So for hydrogen, there do need to have specialized tanker trucks. And there is basically some, and there's different terms for it, but the concept is like there's like, it dissipates or like evaporation, or they call it burn off. So if you, let's say if you were to drive all the way, across the US in a big tanker truck, and do it, there's only a certain percent. It's not like it dissipates by, 50%, but it's certainly a consideration. And then also the tankers that are needed. Although when I was talking about new technologies, there's even a company here in Michigan, Noble Gas, and they are actually, have tanks that are certified for hydrogen. So it's great to have so many new technologies developed here in Michigan. So then we can really have this as a good, market for us. And then so for the use today, a lot of the production is really on site, or, when you think about these very large, steel factories, it's not just, kind of one building. There's, a lot of space for all the raw materials, and then, obviously what's produced going out. So then there's usually the hydrogen produced right there on site, and then, just kind of filtered through, internally within the kind of factory. But then, for, some of the uses now, there could be essentially like, a kind of microgrid concept where, there could be smaller scales, and a lot of the new technologies for hydrogen production are taking that model. So then there could be kind of modular, system to say, okay, what's the demand, in this area for like a fleet, or we're saying behind the fence, so if it was for forklifts, or just, a certain company has, so many trucks that, travel around, locally or the US, then, they could have it just right on their site and only for use for their company. Or then if there's more of a public station that could take any of these trucks, or if there happen to be some passenger vehicles, so more of a public station. And that's what we're planning. We could actually do either one. And there's different sizes of the stations too, of whether, it's kind of, well, for us, maybe 1.3 ton. And with some of these fueling stations, they can just, they kind of come on a truck and you don't have to dig underground. You think of all these gas stations that are all around, and usually they have these large tanks, under the ground. So again, there's more of these kind of modular systems. So then, for deployments, right? And, I think it's everyone's thinking now with infrastructure, right? It's a challenge, and there's a lot of upfront capital costs. So, how do you kind of start with a smaller, pilot or smaller system, and then you can just grow as there's more use for it. Or even new technologies, right? It's very interesting. You look around and you see, some of these, even, people complain about electric wires on poles now, and, compared to underground, or, with distribution, auxiliary power is something that, a lot of people are looking at, and hydrogen can actually be used for that as well.
Well, that's fascinating. So if I'm hearing you correctly, hydrogen is naturally occurring, so it can be extracted as a source, and there are considerations you highlighted regarding the permanence of the site, the purity of the hydrogen you're extracting, and it can be transported via truck and through pipeline, but it can also be manufactured on site in the kind of a chemical manufacturing facility setting, and then transported locally or however long it needs to go from there. And it sounds to me that your company, if you're meeting with the prospective client, then you're identifying, okay, where are we going to source the hydrogen? If it's in California, perhaps there's some infrastructure there. If it is in another part of the country that doesn't have the infrastructure, perhaps it can be manufactured either on site or nearby. So am I kind of thinking about it the right way with regard to the solution that your company would provide, Christa?
Initially, let's say if we were to open a station now, we would need to purchase the hydrogen, and it is available from a few different companies. And like I said, with any of the, steel manufacturing, there's quite a lot of that here in Michigan. So there is availability. And, we would just have, tankers delivered. But what we are planning with our hydrogen technology that we're developing, it is going to take some time to commercialize, but then we would plan to have that in, kind of a scaled production. So depending on the demand, we could have, a smaller or larger, facility.
Oh, that's really fascinating. So, I mean, it's just really, I'm learning so much in terms of this. Hydrogen has been around, but it's still in some ways, it's nascent stages for growing and kind of penetrating the market more. So, you highlighted data, you highlighted the amount of hydrogen that's available. Thinking about when you go to investors, when you're going to pitch the solution, what kind of things is your audience looking for, and kind of like the quality of data that's behind it? Can you talk to that aspect of things, Christa?
Right. Yeah, actually, it's really interesting, and it also evolves over time. I think with what venture capital is interested in, particularly because there's so much interest in AI, right? So first off, we have to get the attention of the investors, but I think they realize that there's hard tech is what it's really called. So trying to make something. So having the hydrogen technology as an opportunity, and certainly we're planning to have a significantly lower cost, maybe even half of what the industry cost is today, and so that's exciting for them. And I think it's just having more of kind of realistic numbers. I hear a lot that they're like, well, we don't want to see your sales going to $1 billion, right? How many companies are $1 billion, revenue companies? So, and, if we were to, maybe have 10 factories, maybe we would get there, but you have to, start with one. So I think it's really critical to show, really more the milestones, and, talking about, offtake agreements. That's really, any of the, hydrogen or other kind of gaseous companies, you're looking at offtake agreements. So are you going to have a customer that's going to, buy from you at least, you need to know what your break even is, right? So then, if everyone thinks, well, it's really 5 or 10, or if your break even is 200 and there's only 200 trucks on the road, right? They do some kind of sanity checking for,
Sure.
what the real, customer demand, could be. And
then
I
the
think
corresponding timeline, like you mentioned, project milestones, right?
mm-hmm. Right, right. And having a clear sense of what the cash flow is. So I know, previously, and people always give these announcements of money that they've raised, but I think now is the time where there may be a commitment, but not necessarily, and let's just say round numbers, 100 million. If a company is giving 100 million, they may not issue 100 million, day one. They may have tracked these milestones, and really looking at what the forecast is, what is long lead, understanding. And someone just said, okay, well, maybe like for us, with our station, if we're not going to have it on the ground for 6 months, but maybe we need to pay a deposit, what do we need, to really prepare the site? I think, that's, some of the considerations. And I think, with a lot of startups, I've been around to a lot of the different, they call incubators here in Michigan. There's many of them. There's New Lab that's doing a lot of great work. I'm, a member of Tech Town. And, people will think about their, kind of individual unit and, oh, we're producing this, this is, what we need, the materials we need to buy, but, putting into a great big facility and managing that with all the power that you need air compressors, other things, and then really the cash flow. And actually I've become an advisor for quite a few startups that I've met, basically just to help them, think about how to manage the cash flow and what they might need. And, there's also working capital, like how many materials do you have to buy and all the systems that they need. So that's something that's really critical. Maybe a few years ago when, interest rates were really low, people, could do a lot, but now, working with banks for, different, credit facilities or, just different ways of cash. And there's, shifts in the market too, that can happen. Or, look what happened, with maybe some of these cyber incidents or, other, just things happen. So you really have to kind of plan for different situations.
Well, that's really fascinating insight. And at the top of the program, we talked about your role and the many hats that you wear. And just what you just described speaks so largely to the sound financial planning, scenario planning, the what if. You mentioned interest rates. We've had changes in administrations. There may be programs that are more favorable for newer environmental technologies. So, can you tell us a little bit about how you're factoring things like interest rates or promotion of alternative fuels from a government and a regulatory perspective?
Right.
I mean, those are considerations I would think you have to take into account, because you mentioned a lot of things with regard to when do you need this infrastructure and, how is the money metered out, if you will. Can you talk to that a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. And with our planning, we are looking at different, lease models and financing that does take into consider the interest rates. So, we are always, a bit conservative with that planning. And, with the government grants, it was something that we thought as an opportunity, but not necessarily in our, main business model and calculations. Just because when there were some of the programs last year, we did enter into the RFP for, with the hydrogen hub, there were some different projects, but we always knew federal money wouldn't necessarily come fast. So we thought of it as an opportunity and, something we were active with, but some of those programs have been canceled. And so, and there is still the, tax credit for production. So that's something that, we really are trying to capitalize on. But again, that's just, kind of another line in our financial models. So I think taking a layered approach, and, when it comes to AI, it may facilitate, but also kind of make it more complicated to try and look, layer in those different opportunities and risks within a financial model and scenario planning. So I think it's just really important to kind of keep track of the different models because, and actually it was interesting. I did talk to one bank. It was a presentation for small businesses talking about, the Small Business Administration loans and programs. And when it came to scenario planning, they said, don't put it in. They're like, we'll run our own models. Just give us your, what you really think you're confident with. So, maybe that's a little tip too, just be, clear about the numbers. And I think, even with AI, I would say, keep track of, what the prompts that you really asked, AI or the different models to do. So.
Yeah, that makes sense from here are my assumptions, here are the governing principles, here are the other considerations, and AI can certainly perhaps be another input to that. But the human, like you said, sanity check and just kind of keeping account of all the considerations becomes really, really important. Christa, this has been such a fascinating conversation. And as we look to wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to highlight that perhaps we hadn't had a chance to touch on up to this point?
Well, I think with hydrogen, there have been a few challenges, cancellation of some of the programs, and with the industry, maybe taking not as much kind of interest in deploying some of the trucks. It is an investment. It's a very expensive investment to add, whether you're transitioning to any new vehicle. Like I said, with school buses, some of those are older. What are they transitioning? So there is actually another model too of retrofitting some vehicles, or they're calling repowering. So that's another opportunity to, kind of work with a piece of equipment that's there and, then with very little additional expense, and then, can make the machinery more efficient. Everyone thinks, you add a new engine into an old truck, just as long as it's not going to shake apart, that's another option within the industry as well. So there's a lot of great opportunity, new technologies, the efficiency, the use, a lot of the drivers, are really happy with the performance. And so it's a really great time for people to really be brave enough to launch, because it's just going to be kind of a snowball effect of deployments, and hopefully we'll have great success here in Michigan and other states in the U.S.
What exciting propositions. Thanks for bringing up the retrofitting example too, because certainly that makes a lot of economic sense in a lot of cases. So to your point about financial modeling, it could be the best scenario to go with for a variety of organizations. So just a couple of fun closeout questions. You mentioned living you said China, you've been in Texas, Michigan, and other parts of the country. Mm-hmm. What are some of the favorite foods and things that you've sort of acquired along the way?
Yeah. So actually, I really love berries. So raspberries, anything. And actually, one place lived in Washington State, and we would go with my family and pick some wild raspberries and blackberries.
Oh, you can't beat fresh off the vines, right?
I know. And then brisket. So, for my days in Texas, a good friend of mine in high school, his mom would do, make her own barbecue sauce and smoke the brisket for hours or days or something. And you just really can't beat it. So.
I'm getting hungry just thinking about it. Have you made your own brisket then? Have you been inspired to do the slow cook?
Well, we've done it a few times, but it's just not as good. So I leave it to the people that are smokers, the ones who really love what they do, and they're the ones that
it's a process. It's a lot of time. Yeah. Right. And then in terms of places you like to spend time, whether activities, vacation spots, it seems like you've been able to travel a little bit around the world. So what are some of the places that perhaps you love going to and recommend to friends, or that you may be looking to on the horizon?
Well, actually, I really love Italy. So just, I studied Latin as my foreign language. We could talk about that a whole other day, but, it was really interesting. I've traveled there, quite a few times, and certainly like around Pompeii, I had always wanted to go there. It's great. And then there's others, you can just drive around, and there's so many just kind of historical sites to see that aren't on the main, list of most of the tourists, and just really enjoy, fresh seafood and the whole entire environment in Italy. There's many other places around the world that have something similar too, but that's, a special spot for me.
Well, thanks for sharing that. And great food selections from berries to brisket to seafood. And in Italy, you can't go wrong, it sounds like. So,
That's
Christa,
right.
thanks again for spending the time with me. Thank you to all of our listeners. We hope you enjoyed and learned a little bit from this episode. And until the next time, we bid you all a great day.